Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jacob Levy, the coordinator of the Research Group on Constitutional Studies, and welcome to this next event in the Research Group on Constitutional Studies Lecture Series. I begin by acknowledging that McGill University is situated on land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst indigenous nations, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse indigenous peoples whose presence still marks this site on which the peoples of the world now meet. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies, a unit of the Jan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, brings together scholars from across mainly political science, philosophy, and law, who study the values, institutions, and principles that make up the basic frameworks of societies. It includes faculty, postdoctoral fellows, PhD fellows, and the Charles Taylor RGCS Student Fellowship, whose members are here with us tonight. The RGCS Lecture Series, supported in part by a generous grant from the Institute for Liberal Studies, brings leading researchers across the range of disciplines and interdisciplinary fields of study with which RGCS comes into contact, and asks them to come present their research on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in a way that is accessible to advanced undergraduates and a broad student academic audience, aiming to overcome the traditional division between those who speak to researchers at universities and those who only come to speak to undergraduates. It is our view and has been our experience that outstanding researchers are very often also outstanding teachers. And we ask our colleagues from around the world to come put those skills together for this audience. Our speaker for today is Emily Nacol, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and in the Graduate Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Professor Nacol holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge, where she studied medieval political thought, an MA in political science from the University of Chicago, where her thesis was on ancient political thought, and a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago, where her dissertation was on early modern political thought, which is to say, from the very beginning of her academic career, Emily Nacol has been a very broad-ranging historian of political thought, looking for connections across thinkers, across eras, and across themes, to put them together to help us understand the ways in which fundamental problems of political life have been treated in intellectual history in ways that can inform how we think about them today. She is the author of An Age of Risk from Princeton University Press, a wonderful book that treats images of risk and understandings of the management of risk in Hobbes, Locke, David Hume, and Adam Smith. It's a book that is partly about the development of scientific and mathematical ideas of probability and risk, and partly about the development of early modern political economy and the emerging idea that risk was in some meaningful sense potential opportunity that could be calculated and acted upon. That combination of interests, how to think about early modern political economy and how to think about uncertainty, has continued to form her research ever since. She has written on figures in early modernity, including Montesquieu, Bernard de Mandeville. She is at work on two books, one of which you will hear about tonight, the other of which treats early modern considerations of work and labor, and how it is that early modern thinkers, especially in Britain, thought about the emergence of a working class as both a fact of political economy and a source of uncertainty, potential risk, potential danger to the body politic. Her work draws on political economy as a field of study, but puts it into conversation with analyses of the way that metaphors and images drawn from such such diverse fields as thinking about insurance and thinking about pandemic plagues, informs the way that people shape their ideas about political life. Professor Nacol has been a member of the faculty at Vanderbilt University. She's held fellowships from the Political Theory Project at Brown University, the Society for the Humanities at Cornell University, and the Jackman Institute for the Humanities at the University of Toronto. This is her first time speaking at an RGCS event, but she has longtime connections to RGCS, including as a teacher and advisor to a number of our alumni who have gone on to study at the University of Toronto, and as the teacher who introduced Michelle Atkin, whom many of you know as the indefatigable conference organizer and event assistant who has worked with RGCS for the last several years and is also herself an alum of the Taylor Fellowship Program. Professor Nacol was the teacher who first introduced her to political theory and sent her our way, for which we are profoundly grateful. Please join me in welcoming Professor Emily Nacol.
All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'd like to start by thanking Jacob for the invitation to be here with all of you today and to talk about some of my ongoing work. I'm really honored to be included in this speaker series, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming this frigid afternoon. So for me, this is a very special way to start a new year and a new term. I'd also like to thank Michelle Atkin, who has disappeared, Jean-Félix Caron, and Andy Catalano for all their work to arrange my visit to Montreal and McGill. And as I think Jacob maybe didn't say in his introduction, I share an experience in common with quite a few of you here, as Jacob was my teacher and supervisor in graduate school and has mentored me through many scholarly, teacherly, and professional challenges in my career. He may not appreciate me informing you that you will be able to count on him for decades after your graduation, but I don't think that his persistent generosity is a terribly well-kept secret among those who know him. Still, I have been very fortunate in this regard, and I'd like to take the opportunity to say a public thanks. All right, so I'd like to begin today by explaining how the content of my talk fits into a broader project that I've been working on for a few years now. And so this is point 1A on your outline, a brief introduction. So I hope you will tolerate the slightly autobiographical character of the introduction, but I think such an approach both fits with the materials I will talk about and I think might also further acknowledge the experience that has unfortunately made armchair experts of all of us on the question of the politics of pandemic. So my research agenda, as Jacob said, is broadly organized around the sticky problem of how human beings cope with risk. I'm keenly interested in how our efforts to perceive and act on a future that is still fundamentally unknown to us shapes our politics, our political attitudes, behaviors, relationships, and institutions. And I think we can and must make normative political judgments about how well or how poorly we do this. And I'm interested in learning from how people have done this in the past. I focus mainly on the early modern period, which I think is a very fertile period for the rise of risk in the European context, but this is, of course, not the only story to be told about risk in its history. Most of my work on this question of risk has stayed quite squarely in the realm of politics and political economy, but a few years ago I began to wonder, well, what about epidemiological risk? What do looming public health crises demand of us politically? How do we address these crises individually and collectively while they're still ongoing? And while they're producing all other kinds of related social, political, and economic risks of their own. So I started to wonder what political theorists might have to say about these questions. And as is my bent, I turned to the history of political thought. And in all honesty, I found less than I had hoped. So I cast a bit of a wider net, looking at other forms of political thinking and writing. Narrative nonfiction and fiction began to really capture my imagination and help me get some analytic purchase on my questions. And so I built a bibliography of interventions from thinkers and writers like Thucydides, Lucretius, Boccaccio, Daniel Defoe, Albert Camus, José Saramago, Emily St. John Mandel, Michel Foucault, Susan Sontag, René Girard, and historians and activists from the ACT UP movement. And this raised for me a disciplinary question that I really hadn't counted on, which is what counts as political theory in plague time? So this sort of motley crew of thinkers, actors, and writers has really helped me organize my thinking and writing around a series of themes and problems that characterize living through an epidemic. These include the pursuit of trustworthy knowledge from reliable authorities, the fragility and necessity of social and political solidarity in times of plague, the strange and distinctive experience of time during pandemics, the scope of freedom in times of collective disaster, the allure of a politics of blame and its relationship to political responsibility when trying to sort out what has happened and what needs to happen next. And lastly, how the state is made and unmade in various ways by official responses to epidemiological crisis. And I would wager that pretty much everyone in this room has thought about each of these questions in depth for ourselves, for we really haven't had much of a choice. So I would like for political theory to help us in this inquiry. And my modest aim is really to produce a collection of essays, which is a new genre for me as a writer, that explores each of these themes. And I hope to write them as a political theorist who draws on texts and interpretive practice to explore political problems. And I hope that the collection as a whole will have something to say about the value of having more capacious accounts of what we consider political theory. So I hope that its secondary contribution will be to ongoing dialogues within our discipline about our sources and resources and our canons. And then finally, and as a brief aside, I became convinced this might be a viable writing and research project thanks to a group of students at the University of Toronto, undergrads and graduate students who agreed to let me take the plunge into this intellectual experiment as their seminar teacher in the fall of 2019, which is very strange timing that we didn't understand until much later. We read from the work of a number of the authors that I've just named, and these students explored the questions that I've listed in our discussion and in their papers and research projects. And they also brought a very healthy dose of skepticism to the project itself. And some of these conversations continued the next semester remotely as we all left our shared campus spaces for a lockdown beginning in March of 2020. And in the last 3 years, I have really thought about these students and our work almost daily. And it is especially meaningful to me to be here today with an audience that includes both undergraduate and graduate students to once again talk about these themes. And I think 2 people from the class are here, which is an unexpected delight. So with that, let me move directly into the substance of my talk for today and to point 1B on your outline. So my talk for today is entitled A More Onerous Citizenship, Political Theory in Plague Time. And the title refers to an early moment in the 20th century American cultural critic Susan Sontag's wonderful essay, Illness as Metaphor. There, Sontag writes, and I'll quote her, "Illness is the night side of life, a more onerous citizenship. Everyone who is born holds dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and in the kingdom of the sick. Although we all prefer to use only the good passport, sooner or later, each of us is obliged, at least for a spell, to identify ourselves as citizens of that other place," unquote. I think her words are very evocative. Most fundamentally, she challenges us to confront illness and disability not as experiences that befall others, but as ones that await each of us. But as a political theorist, I'm quite drawn to her framing. She casts this inevitable experience of sickness as an experience of citizenship, membership, and residence in a shared polity, a kind of place we will occupy, live in, and work with others, even as we continue to look back to easier forms of individual and shared life that we knew in our former homeland, the so-called Kingdom of the Well. So for the rest of my lecture, I'll focus on one text that exemplifies the type of political exploration of this night side of citizenship that Sontag invites us to perform. And this is Daniel Defoe's 1722 novel, A Journal of the Plague Year. Defoe was a serious, some might say relentless, student of the causes and consequences of the bubonic plague. He became an active theorist and prognosticator of how its risks, which he classified as both bodily and spiritual, might be better managed by governments, families, and individuals. So to put this another way, he spent his time studying Sontag's so-called other place, this kingdom of the unwell, and trying to prepare the British public for potential membership there. As part of this effort, Defoe published two major works almost at the same time in 1722. One was a nonfiction book of concrete recommendations and policy advice called Due Preparations for the Plague, as well as for Soul as for Body. Early modern titles are always so long. And then he also had a fictional companion that he composed, a journal of the plague year. We should treat these texts as partners, but today I will focus mainly on the fictional journal as a work of political thought and as an imaginative intervention that was meant to bring some of Defoe's knowledge and his anxieties about citizenship in plague time to life for a literate early modern public. So why this double effort and why 1722? Defoe's readerly audience had been sitting in Britain for nearly 2 years, receiving piecemeal reports of the deadly progress of a bout of bubonic plague that was ripping through Marseille on the other side of the English Channel. Defoe wanted his readers to recognize the geographical and temporal urgency of their situation. Plague had a history of traveling from port to port, and it could arrive and tear through London at any time. So really, Defoe was sounding an alarm. We are sitting ducks, and this demands something of us as a people. And to drive this call home to as broad an audience as he could muster, he moved beyond the due preparations to publish the journal, a fictional retelling of London's last great plague in 1665 and 1666. And he staged it as a survivor's journal and an eyewitness account. Defoe's journal has been very well explored and well analyzed by early modern historians and literary scholars who themselves have worked out some of the political implications of Defoe's really startlingly realistic novel. The text also had something of a popular resurgence in 2020 as new readers picked it up to try to find connections with their own experiences with COVID-19. We political theorists have done very little with it, however, and I think there are reasons why we should turn to it. And I'll try to show what these are by doing some work with the text today. So this takes me to point 2 on your outline. I'd like to spend just a little bit of time walking us through the character of Defoe's novel and its distinguishing features, qualities that make it both quite engaging to read, but also a bit of a tough nut to crack interpretively. So first, Defoe situates the novel between past and future. As noted just a few minutes ago, it's set in 1665 and 1666 in London, and it recounts the city's Great Plague, what turned out to be its last major visitation of the bubonic plague. This would have been a huge relief to poor Defoe, who thought the next catastrophe would be arriving at any day, but really the book is centered on the last arrival. The journal draws on Defoe's extensive research into the conditions and difficulties of that time period when we think just under 20% of London's population, or roughly 100,000 people, succumbed to illness, and many more suffered both materially and psychologically. And the novel itself is written in the form of a memoir, more even than a journal. It is a survivor's journal in which he recounts his memories of that time. So Defoe really places the text squarely in the past twice over. But it also is really about the future. Defoe is orienting his readers in the present of 1722 to what might be coming in the near future, a plague that may already even be in London from Marseille. As he suggests in the journal's companion text, The Due Preparations, he thinks it is, quote, reasonable for Londoners at least to put ourselves in a posture not to be surprised if we should meet with the same here, unquote, as in Marseille. So the journal, too, is a preparatory work that demands its readers draw on fictionalized experiences of the past to ready themselves for a catastrophe that may or may not happen in the future. Second, it has a narrator, a local saddler known only to the reader by his initials HF. Quite a few scholars have speculated that HF is in fact Henry Foe, an uncle of Defoe's. From the first page of the novel, we know that H.F. survives the plague, having never fled the city as many others did. And this might have been a matter of H.F.'s temperament, and it may also, too, have been a consequence of what we might now call his class position. Artisans, traders, and people of the middling sort stayed in London to make their trades and survive. So, too, did poor people who had nowhere else to go. H.F.'s recollections partly reflect what he says he heard from others who stayed, but he also shows himself to be something of a man about town. While he describes a London that is semi-deserted and marked by confinement, he appears to have circulated everywhere and seen nearly everything. So through H.F., Defoe's novel documents the passage of time, the geographical and temporal spread of illness, the rise of mortality rates, and the scientific, spiritual, material, and political reverberations of disease. And so his words reflect much of the historical record from that period, at least as Defoe knew it. And this gets us to the third feature of the novel. Defoe's vivid renderings of the spread of disease through the streets and alleys of London, the private decisions made by individuals to flee the city, and the varied private and public efforts to stop the spread of infection nearly belie the journal's status as fiction. So initially, the novel was actually received as a kind of found object, an extant diary or journal that Defoe sort of lightly edited, rather than as the conscious work of creative fiction on his part that we think it really was. And this problem was only heightened by the persistent view that Defoe was, for much of his life, a truly slippery agent, if not a totally bald-faced liar. So the question of Defoe's character aside, this interpretive puzzle about his novel has really stayed alive over centuries. Casual readers and critics alike have long commented on the journal's remarkable verisimilitude. And they've also argued about whether to categorize it as a work of historical fiction, a survival manual, a treatise, a work of journalistic reporting, or an elaborate extended metaphor for the circulation of capital. Any of these classificatory interpretations can be made pretty persuasively, I think. And I'm not sure it's worth making a definitive choice as a reader or interpreter. Rather, I take this uncertainty to be a source of the text's strength. As the literary scholar and poet Travis Lau has persuasively argued, part of what makes the journal worth engaging is that it is so, as he says, persistently uncategorizable and rich with contradiction and paradox. And I agree with Lau that this genre confusion is perhaps productive for the reader, if a bit frustrating at times. And then fourth and finally, I'd like to comment on the tone of the novel, which is perhaps another source of uncertainty for the reader. Defoe published the journal with great urgency at a time of profound risk. He really sincerely thought another visitation of the plague was imminent, and he had very good reason to wager on this probable disaster. So his primary purpose as an author is really not in doubt. His aim was to warn and advise. But as the scholar Annika Mann has, in my view, correctly pointed out, the text itself has a strong quality of self-reflection and is, as she says, supremely ambivalent. What does this mean? For all Defoe's efforts to warn the public and to urge due preparations for the plague, and for all of the ink that he spills to paint a devastating portrait of plague time as a kind of hell on earth, the novel is surprisingly neither very pedantic nor terribly prescriptive. Instead, Defoe makes vivid to his readers the moral and practical dilemmas generated by the onset of a disease that moves rapidly through a community. What is to be done, and how are we to live in a time of ongoing catastrophe? These two questions, with very few answers, are really what remain by the time we readers finish and close the book. So through the recollections of H.F., a stubbornly healthy man who moves freely, and as some interpreters have noted, chaotically and defiantly within a city of illness and death, Defoe offers readers an account of what it was like to be a victim twice over, of both the plague itself and also of some of the preventative and curative measures used to fight it. The text imaginatively renders and presents what the historian Paul Slack will later name as the plague time problem of knowing, and I'll quote Slack here, how far the interests of public safety should be allowed to override those of private individuals. So the novel itself, as best I can tell, never exactly weighs in on how to strike the proper balance between the interests of public safety and those of private persons. Instead, it really lays out for readers the real difficulties and ambiguities that haunt both personal and public decision-making in pandemic conditions. Defoe also quite ably blurs the line between these categories of public and private, with no effort really to resharpen it for the reader. And so to me, this is part of the text's great value. It elicits the sympathy of its reader while leaving her to form her own moral and political judgments. It is a taxing read, one that serves readers' imaginative renderings of profound human suffering, right alongside rather dry data tables of mortality and illness data. I hear some chuckles, so maybe some of you have seen them. Together, these bring to life the experience of onerous citizenship in that other place, to recall Sontag's words. But it also leaves us with very few prescriptions. This restraint from Defoe, I think, is especially remarkable when we hold the journal against his work in the due preparations, where he lays out exactly what he thinks should be done. Quarantine the ships, man the ports, stay home, follow the science. But in his fictional account, his focus is on building a narrative that strikes the reader as painfully truthful. It doesn't mince words or numbers when it comes to describing what it could be like to live through a plague and through responses to plague as well. But few words are reserved for judgment or moralization. The message to the reader in 1722 seems to be, hurry up and prepare yourself before it's too late, but be circumspect even as you rush to prepare. And this is, I think, a hard message to sit with. So those are the four qualities I would like to stress about the text itself. Its position between past and future, its use of first-person narrative, its tendency to scramble our sort of feeble scholarly efforts at genre classification, and its ability to convey urgency while still holding on to moral and political ambivalence. I think these qualities work in tandem to activate the moral and political imagination of readers and to solicit our reason and judgment about how best to meet the challenges of plague time with all of the sacrifices and trade-offs that this demands from ordinary people. All right, now we shall get to the text. So this brings me to point 3 on the outline. While Defoe's journal is a very rich resource for scholars of risk, one that touches upon many of the themes and queries I outlined at the beginning of my talk today, I will focus mainly on 2. First, I would like to show how Defoe highlights the knowledge problems that hound efforts to preserve a society and its members in the advent of an epidemiological crisis, problems of cause as well as cure. How do these affect relations of trust and authority is the political question here, and what risks are further produced by epidemiological crises of this kind? And then secondly, I want to turn to Defoe's reflections on the policy of quarantine, which are highly ambivalent and for that reason, I think, very ripe for moral and political evaluation if we want to think about public safety and private interests and desires. So my purpose for the next while is to think through how Defoe represents what we might call 2 pathways to public safety, the search for knowledge and the search for measures to stop the spread. And these, of course, go together. Through the critical but not wholly unsympathetic eyes of H.F., who recalls walking the London streets and taking in the sights and sounds of plagues when he knows he shouldn't, Defoe spins out a story of suffering people grasping at straws in the wake of both epistemological and political failures. He also tells the story of how disease itself is shaped by the built environment, by social factors, and by political decisions. So in many respects, the whole text is a story of struggle and failure in 1665 and 66, a choice that makes some sense when we think about Defoe's purposes in publication, which were to prevent another visitation or to ease people through it more ably. He's very attuned to what historians like Slack will later argue about the disease, and this is a short quote from Slack again, that plague was both an independent historical actor coming from outside and altering, sometimes radically, the social and economic environment, and also a dependent variable, itself shaped by the environments it encountered and the ways in which people responded to it. So let's start with the knowledge side of Defoe's representation of the risks of plague, and this gets us to point 3A on the outline. Through HF's recollections, the journal's readers are given a short survey of early modern medical debates about what was causing a disease that had haunted Europe for quite some time. And this is a story of uncertainty, partial knowledge, and efforts to find new knowledge. Partway through his narrative, HF pauses to consider possible explanations of how the plague spread so rapidly through his devastated city in 65 and 66. Based on his own observations and experiential reasoning, he concludes that it must have been airborne, a matter of what he calls, memorably, a fatal breath that was communicated between individuals. But even that conclusion is not so certain. And here I refer you to passage 1 on your handout, where HF says that the plague must have been transmitted by some certain steams or fumes, which the physicians call effluvia, by the breath or by the sweat or by the stench of the sores of the sick persons, or some other way, perhaps even beyond the reach of the physicians themselves, which effluvia affected the sound, who come within certain distance of the sick, immediately penetrating the vital parts of the said sound person, putting their blood into an immediate ferment and agitating their spirits to that degree which it was found they were agitated. And so these newly infected persons communicated it in the same manner to others. So what you might notice in this passage is its documentation of many possibilities when it comes to transmission and infection, even as Defoe, through the figure of HF, is laying out the most up-to-date knowledge available. This short paragraph, I think, really points to the confusion that stymied efforts to understand the mechanism of transmission. The closest HF ever really comes to a reasonable explanation is that the disease was some kind of contagion passed between persons, but he doesn't completely understand how it did so, and he lands on this notion of fatal breath as likely, but not certain. What an image. So perhaps frustratingly for contemporary readers, HF also briefly considers and then dismisses out of hand as a discourse full of learned simplicity, an account of infection that looks like a rudimentary version of what will later be known as germ theory. And he observes that some people, and I'll quote him here, talk of infection being carried on by the air only, by carrying with it a vast number of insects and invisible creatures who enter into the body with the breath, or even at the pores with the air, and there generate or emit most acute poisons that then penetrate the blood and cause infection. Elsewhere, he comments, I think in one of the most memorable moments in the journal, that he has heard people muse that if the infected were to breathe on a piece of glass, quote, were the breath condensing, there might be living creatures be seen by a microscope of strange, monstrous, and frightful shapes, such as dragons, snakes, serpents, and devils, horrible to behold. This is, I think, such a fanciful and almost whimsical depiction of what magnified pathogens might look like. HF ultimately questions the veracity of this kind of talk as mere speculation, and he returns ultimately to the idea that plague has to spread through contagion, perhaps by air or some form of close contact. And he ultimately settles on a view that closely resembles popularly held miasma theories, even as he emphasizes that he, too, really can't grasp how this plague is spread. Nor was he alone in this. HF is not only uncertain himself when it comes to understanding the causes of what was happening all around him, he is also a chronicler of how other more essential authorities were confused and made a series of choices that at best didn't help very much, and at worst heightened the frequency of death and suffering. So as the plague worsened, London witnessed the breakdown of medical expertise as well. In a striking passage, HF compares the devastating effects of the plague on the medical community to the instability of London's infrastructure to beat back the devastating Great Fire that would come the year after. And this is passage 2 on your handout. So there he writes, through HF, I shall not be supposed to lessen the authority or capacity of the physicians when I say that the violence of the distemper, when it came to its extremity, was like the fire the next year. The fire which consumed what the plague could not touch, defied all the application of remedies, the fire engines were broken, the buckets thrown away, and the power of man was baffled and brought to an end. So the plague defied all medicine. The very physicians were seized with it, with their preservatives in their mouths, and men went about prescribing to others and telling them what to do, till the tokens were upon them, and they dropped down dead, destroyed by that very enemy they directed others to oppose. So I think this passage illustrates very vividly that the plague really confounded the experts who had stepped forward to fight it. Their instruments of care and cure were thrown away and broken, their knowledge deemed powerless. Many of them fell ill themselves and died, which Defoe highlights to underscore how little anyone knew about prevention or cure. Although HF's own theories are steeped in conventional wisdom about the etiology and epidemiology of plague, to use our contemporary language, he resists another type of conventional explanation altogether, and this is quite interesting to me. He resists moralistic pronouncements interpreting the plague visitation as a divine intervention that punished deserving parties while sparing the innocent. Although he admits that perhaps some ill-chosen behaviors could have, at points, brought still healthy people into contact with the infected, he does not present plague as a punishment or affliction from God for those risky choices, or really any choices at all that were made before the time of plague, moral choices or otherwise. This isn't to say that the possibility of interpreting the outbreak as some kind of divine punishment for the community has never tempted our narrator. Indeed, HF comments in hindsight that popular opinion, and I'll quote him here, when the fears of the people were young, unquote, and the disease still relatively contained, held that a comet seen just before the start of the plague and another that appeared just before the fire that followed were, quote, the forerunners and warnings of God's judgment on London. So for HF's part, the second comet's appearance could not help but worry him a little that the plague had not been quite enough and that God was going to send London one more catastrophe for good measure. But still, in spite of this temporary lapse into superstition, he credits himself with adopting a skeptical perspective towards theological or moralistic explanations for natural disasters like the plague. So he turns, and Defoe urges his readers to turn instead to more natural explanations rooted in cause and effect, even though he, like everyone else, is never able to really settle on one that totally satisfies him. So HF's self-reported and very cool-headed contemplation of the causes of infection stands in, I think, marked contrast to much of the rest of society as he remembers it. And now we turn to the public. So through HF's recollections, Defoe depicts the public as a crowd of frantic people, highly susceptible to all kinds of explanations and solutions for the horrors of plague. Although HF recalls their behaviors and choices with something of a tinge of exasperation, he never really portrays them as anything other than sympathetic figures. Their futile search for information is something that he identifies with, and I think here we can see some of that ambivalence that characterizes the novel. Sorrow and anxiety were everywhere for many months, and so lots of people were in hot pursuit of safety and relief, trying to find ways to predict or calculate their individual risks of illness and death and to protect themselves against these. So this unsuccessful quest for reliable knowledge and I think relief only compounded their bodily vulnerability in a time of infection, and it also left them psychologically vulnerable to superstition, fraud, and quackery. And these are traced very carefully in the text. So the collapse of medicine itself as a body of knowledge and a class of professional healers really created an opening for individual and makeshift solutions to the onset of plague. So here we see how one risk produces another. And this is really one of the few places in the text, I think, where we find Defoe articulating a very harsh moral judgment through the voice of his narrator, but not against ordinary people seeking help and cures wherever they can find them. His anger is reserved instead for those who exploited them, as he notes that while conventional medicine couldn't really save people, quackery harmed them outright. H.F. remarks that, and this is his language, quack operators not only took the money of people seeking help, but also gave them all kinds of remedies that hurt them. Some poisoned them, either killing them or weakening them and making their bodies even more susceptible to infection. None cured them. So H.F. documents how opportunists exploited the ongoing risk of plague to profit from the ignorance and desperation of people who feared infection, wryly noting, in what turns out to be an important passage for me as someone who's interested in risk, that one mischief always introduces another. So here we have a clear insight into how one risk, the risk of illness and fatality from plague, produces another. The risk of harm posed by opportunists who exploited the vulnerable seeking protection. And in response to this unfortunate trend, local magistrates started to regulate remedies, asking the College of Physicians to publicize the names of reliable ones in print so that people could know. But in large part, this was too late. So Defoe's journal also turns its attention to these public officials as what we might call another community of knowledge makers, as part of his account of how knowledge of disease, or perhaps more accurately, partial knowledge or poor information about disease, is spread. He portrays the circulation of knowledge as something of a triangulated epistemological conflict among an ignorant public officials who had slightly better knowledge, and then amateur calculators, as he calls them, offering to read the signs and portents of a mysterious disease. So from the beginning, public officials really concealed the outbreak from ordinary people as much as they could. And when this became unworkable, they tried to monitor the flow of public information to keep fears from worsening. So by the time the plague was in full swing, there was really no shortage of other sources of information for anxious people. And much of it was terror-inducing beyond the anxieties people already felt. So to take one example, H.F. emphasizes that some well-meaning clergy encouraged fear in the hearts of their congregants in efforts to bring them to quick repentance of sins in the face of looming death, and a proliferation of religious sects and rituals presented a very broad range of options for a populace that was very bent on self-protection. And in truth, many of these religious leaders and rituals made people even more afraid, H.F. documents for us. But these mainstream religious authorities were not the main problem for public officials, Defoe claims. By the time the epidemic was seriously underway, and he writes here, I'll quote him, "The people were more addicted to prophecies and astrological conjurations, dreams, and old wives' tales than ever they were before or since." And H.F.'s suspicion is that people who were able to make money by printing out and peddling these predictions and prognostications were the ones who actually stirred up the fears and superstitions of the public simply for the purpose of profiting from misery. And these are the people that he characterizes bluntly as vicious, perhaps some of the only people he doesn't sympathize with in the text. So although H.F. faults public officials for keeping knowledge of the onset of plague to themselves, he also credits them for other uses of their epistemological authority, namely working to suppress these materials that would aggravate an already disturbed populace and give them false or unreliable information. But as Defoe describes it, their concerted efforts to root out and silence charlatans were not so successful. H.F. notes, in quite a bitter moment in the text, that the plague itself was what put an end to all of it, that it, quote, cleared the town of most of those calculators themselves, unquote, along with their unwitting victims. That only an epidemic could rid a society of fearmongers and profiteers, while the best efforts of public officials were a bit useless, I think points to the ideas that false information circulated almost as quickly as the disease itself, both orally and in print. So Defoe thus establishes plague time as a period not only of epidemiological crisis, but also epistemological crisis. The breakdown of expertise and the absence of any reliable knowledge about the origins of plague, its mode of transmission, and its best antidotes and cures left the public with no clear path to safety. Instead, they were left alone with many competing sources of knowledge and authority to sort through and evaluate in a time of great urgency and desperation. So to return again to Sontag's language, part of what makes the citizenship of the kingdom of the sick so onerous is this experience of navigating uncertainty under conditions that are genuinely life or death, searching for knowledge among conflicting sources, and experiencing the breakdown of trusted authority in real time. So perhaps for this reason, I think a significant feature of HF's reflections is really a noticeable absence. There is very little moralization and blame when it comes to ordinary people and their efforts to secure immunity and cure. HF's observations and corresponding analyses stress that the etiology and epidemiology of plague were fundamentally unknown, even to experts. So the expectation that ordinary citizens should have known how to protect themselves through personal precautions holds almost no weight for them. His only observation is that people did try to avoid the risk of disease and to safeguard themselves against its spread. The failure of their private individual efforts at building immunity and stopping the spread of plague generated a need for a more aggressive, regulated public response to ensure the well-being of a whole community, an endeavor that HF reports with, I think, quite a lot of ambivalence. And so this gets us to the second major theme I'd like to talk about today, and to point 3B on your outline. And this is the double edge of quarantine policy. So Defoe's journal also probes the moral and political dilemmas that characterize living at the intersection of immunity and community, largely through exploring publicly mandated efforts to board up the sick and their families in their own homes. So through HF, he gives us a very vivid account of 17th century quarantine measures, detailing an elaborate system of surveillance designed to keep watch over and control the movements of the infected. He also documents efforts to resist this kind of quarantine. Defoe's analysis, which is filtered again through the observations of HF, is colored by sympathy, and this time it's for the sick and confined, even as he floats the idea that quarantine has the potential to be what he calls a public good that justified the private mischief. Quarantine, perhaps the public health measure that gets the most attention in the journal, becomes an intriguing flashpoint for contradictory claims about security and care, which perhaps aptly reflect the human experience of living in quarantine. So quite early in the journal, HF details the complex system activated to identify, confine, and watch the infected and to keep them from moving throughout the city. While the sick were supposed to self-report to local magistrates, public officials took added precautions by appointing a crew of examiners to go door to door and determine whether there were infected people in any home. And these examiners were appointed by local governments under the threat of punishment for refusing to serve. So this was coerced work. And as you might be wondering, yes, these were largely poor people who were struggling to find work and who hadn't left town. And these examiners were really just the tip of the iceberg. Poor people, mainly poor women, were also sent in as searchers to look for the dead and as nurses for the ill. And as an aside, I think we can credit these people for pretty much all of the numerical data that Defoe presents in the text. They were the ones who really did the documenting and the counting of morbidity and mortality from house to house in every parish that were later presented to the public in the form of broadsides known as the Bills of Mortality, many of which we still have. Kevin Sienna at Trent has done really extensive and fantastic work on these women and their contributions if you're interested in them and want to know more about them. But back to the quarantine policy itself. If an inspection of a particular house should turn up a sick resident, the house was then sealed and its inhabitants, both sick and healthy, barred from exit. And so to ensure that no one left a diseased home, appointed watchers were meant to take turns surveilling it at all hours of the day and night. And these homes were also identified very easily by people passing by. In Thomas Vincent's God's Terrible Voice in the City from 1667, he notes that they were marked with red crosses and their doors were, he says, shut up and fastened on the outside with an inscription, "Lord, have mercy upon us." So homes were, of course, not the only social spaces to be regulated carefully. So were public centers, places of community and activity. But I'm quite interested in focusing on the home as an interesting space that became both public and private in this moment. So HF takes the reader through both residential and commercial streets and alleys that were transformed from places of community and bustling commerce to quite desolate, empty spaces, filled mainly by eerie silence, which he catalogs, or the wailing of the sick. As Paula McDowell astutely comments, Defoe wants us to hear the sounds of the plague, and thus he has HF recall the sounds of suffering in quite a lot of detail. And wailing came most often from quarantined homes that were regulated private spaces that became a sort of dreadful hybrid of prison and cesspool for the sick and their families. And HF struggles openly with policies of quarantine in a way that's quite interesting. He acknowledges that while they might have saved some people, they also resulted in unnecessary deaths and acute psychological torment for the confined, hence his recollection of the wailing. And as he remarks, and this is passage 3 in your handout, it is true that the locking up of the doors of people's houses and setting a watchman there day and night to prevent their stirring out or any coming to them, when perhaps the sound people in the family might have escaped, if they had been removed from the sick, looked very hard and cruel. And many people perished in these miserable confinements, which 'tis reasonable to believe would not have been distempered if they had had liberty, though the plague was in the house. So here, HF points out the obvious downsides of quarantine. It was not only the sick who were confined at home, but their entire households. And so many people who were healthy were nearly buried alive by public mandate on the assumption that they were likely already infected and were already a risk to the public. And many of them died as a result. But even if they had lived, the psychological and physical sufferings of confinement were easy to observe and very acute, he says. HF comments that, quote, "It was generally in such houses that we heard the most dismal shrieks and outcries of the poor people terrified and even frighted to death by the sight of the condition of their dearest relations and by the terror being imprisoned as they were," unquote. So perhaps tellingly, Defoe gives a lot more descriptive attention to the sufferings of the confined, particularly the terror experienced by quarantine healthy people, than he does to any benefits that the efforts to isolate them provided to the public. He structures the novel so that HF's hindsight allows him to state and understand that few, if any, public health measures had really stopped the spread of the illness in the end, although the downsides of each were readily apparent in real time. But beyond the observation that these were not particularly effective measures, there's a broader moral point here as well, that there are genuine costs to making people suffer for the good of the whole community, and these have to be weighed very carefully as part of a moral and political calculus when we think through how to help communities cope with health crises. Now, again, I would stress that Defoe never argues against quarantine as a public health measure anywhere in the text, but he does complicate the picture of what it entails considerably, I think, by representing it as on occasion a source of profound suffering and even danger. HF's readings of how individuals reacted to and resisted these measures is also quite sympathetic, critical, and rich with paradox. Some people tried to break out of their homes once confined, and HF reads their behavior as a sign of the cruelty of the measure. Those who attempted to escape confinement were a pretty varied bunch. Some were healthy people who wanted to flee a sick house. Others were people who were already sick but asymptomatic and ignorant of their pending doom. And still others were sick people who were seeking provision or companionship, who hid their illness and re-entered the outside community. In some cases, public officials had to work hard to stay ahead of the citizenry when it came to confinement, and the text is rich with those kinds of examples. While Defoe gives serious weight to the idea that these escapees posed a real danger to public health, he mostly figures them as victims of both disease and policy. He suggests that they ought not to be blamed for their actions, And he chronicles all of the ways in which confinement made people desperate and made them run out of their houses at all hazards, he says, spreading plague with them as they went. And leaving their homes didn't lessen their sufferings, and it endangered others. But through the observations of HF, Defoe questions whether the policies themselves are responsible for the spread of illness by placing the sick and their families in untenable situations of isolation. And he argues, I think, perhaps against conventional wisdom, that most infected people really understood themselves already as a threat to the public and would have self-isolated at home without much prompting. But when shut up in their homes, they panicked and tried to leave and spread the disease more than they might have otherwise, which he chronicles as a dangerous irony. So in hindsight, HF asserts that most people were public-spirited and mindful of the health of others, and perhaps the extreme measures of isolation and confinement were too much, and perhaps even undercut the potential for solidarity. Here he confronts the persistent belief that people carelessly spread illness to others because of corrupt morals or delusions or desperation brought on by illness. Even as he presents their choices very vividly, he recalls that cases of escape from an infected home were in fact exceptions that proved the rule, and that were often very easily managed by vigilant public servants. So even as his narrative highlights these moments of resistance and refusal, he still argues that for most of the sick, these quarantine measures may have been unnecessary to begin with. As for the healthy, HF admits that no one really understood how plague was transmitted or carried from person to person. So we're back at that point again. This, coupled with his attention to how healthy people suffered terribly by being confined within sick houses, suggests that at least HF did not wholly approve of quarantine as a proper measure. And through his narrator, I think, Defoe openly struggles with the question of whether confinement was worth the burdens it placed on an already suffering people. In a remarkable passage, he reflects that in the end, it, quote, seemed to have no manner of public good in it, equal or proportional to the grievous burden that it was to particular families that were so shut up. That is, confinement policies may have done some good for the public, but wasn't enough to mediate the harms that they did to many specific individuals. He doesn't really say, but he highlights the dilemmas for the reader. So Defoe's analysis, I think, really leaves the reader with no easy answer to how communities should socialize the risks of a pandemic and how preventive measures should be distributed amongst us. As Graham Hamill has persuasively argued, Defoe does highlight the choice to implement quarantine as a political one, and one that shaped how early moderns thought about state sovereignty and even state violence. As he also argues, and as I would emphasize, this depiction of quarantine also raises essential questions about political responsibility and solidarity. Should the burdens of risk rest wholly on the sick and their families? Are their needs opposed to or commensurable with the public good? And finally, is isolation and quarantine the right strategy, or would more communal forms of care better serve both sick people and their communities? With the musings of HF about the causes of plague and the prophylactics and cures pursued by experts and ordinary people alike, the text never tells us really what to think. But we are made by the text to think and to feel. As Travis Lau ruminates, and I'll quote him here, "The journal is devastating because it refuses to offer any certain measures against the disease," unquote. Instead, it leaves us only to consider what was tried, what failed, and what we might think about for the next time. That is, it offers more questions than answers, and perhaps in this way reproduces the lived experience of residing in the kingdom of the sick, especially in the early days, before experts and ordinary people begin to understand more about what is happening and what can be done in response. In this way, Defoe's journal is, as Eula Biss has commented, both near to and far from us. And I hope I've convinced you that she's right about this, that it is the book that's both deeply strange and also very familiar to 21st century readers. All right, I think I have 1 or 2 minutes, so I would just like to make a few words of conclusion now. So this has been, by and large, a very dour and grisly lecture that has highlighted questions and problems that I think cut very close to the bone for many of us these days. And this makes me feel something of an obligation to point out that in spite of its grave attention to failures and disasters in a year of plague, the journal ends on a note of optimism. Although again, Defoe seasons this optimism with a little ambivalence for good measure. I have presented portions of a text that often appears to be nothing so much as a string of remembrances of the despair of an afflicted community, but the narrative ends with survivors meeting in the streets with expressions of happiness and gratitude after it becomes clear that the plague has subsided. They are battered and they're much worse for wear, but they are still alive and still capable of joy. I would suggest that this is not the only point of hope in the journal, for perhaps we can also find some hope in the spaces for ethical and political reflection that Defoe opens up for his readers. Even as he subjects, or in some cases resubjects, readers to the historical trauma of a pandemic, he trusts readers to peer more closely at his narrator's ambivalent reflections on cure, prevention, and care, and to pay very close attention to the indistinct line between private sufferings and public ones. He urges us to draw critical, if provisional, conclusions from these for the next visitation. And perhaps the most important one is that we must make due preparations so that we're more capable of negotiating the moral and political dilemmas that accompany pandemics, and also more able to live with the ambivalence that the decisions we make, or that are made for us, will produce. And this is really why I would count Defoe's text as a work of quite astute political thinking. It clarifies what political questions are the most urgent ones during times of catastrophe. It invites us to look, I think, quite skeptically and sympathetically at those who make competing claims to knowledge and authority. And it urges the reader to hone the critical political faculty of judgment. And it activates our moral imaginations in favor of our fellow residents in the kingdom of the sick, demanding that we think through what care and solidarity may require. All right, thank you. Thank you, that's very nice.
At the RGCS lectures, excuse me, the first question is reserved for one of the undergraduate or master's students in the research group on constitutional studies, Charles Taylor Student Fellowship. So I will take a first question from one of the student fellows, Shalmarina.
Thank you so much for an absolutely wonderful talk, despite how depressing the content of it was. I'm really captivated by your use of fiction and narrative and the way it engages our sympathy. I wonder, though, if part of the value for Defoe is that the fictional situation is one of intensity and crisis. There are a lot of emotions we are made to feel as readers. So I wonder more generally if there is a limit to how far our use of fiction as political theory can go, or if literary resources capture something that other forms of political theory cannot.
That's such an excellent question. Thank you. It's one I've been thinking about a lot in tandem with a graduate student in our department who also looks at literary sources as political theory, and we've been talking about this for some time now. I suppose my provisional answer to this is something I'm still thinking about, is that the value added of this text, in particular the journal, when we compare it to perhaps his more dry, politically oriented policy text, is exactly that, right? That it triggers something in the imaginations of people, and that this is an important faculty that is related to processes of political thinking and judgment. I think what's difficult about treating this text as a work of political theory is that it's not extremely prescriptive, but what it is imaginative, right? At the same time, what I hear in your question a little bit that gives me something to think about is whether these texts can become, for lack of a better way of thinking about it, too emotionally saturated for readers, such that it sort of shuts down some of our critical faculties after we're inundated with these tales of suffering. I think this text in particular veers away from that because it is prose-wise kind of dry as a bone, and it also is jam-packed with tables and data and all kinds of things like that sort of break the experience of certain experiences of imagination and emotional sympathy. So it's an interesting text in that regard. Like, it almost reads as nonfiction, which I think puts it in a quite strange place when it comes to thinking about how fiction can excite the imagination, because so many people didn't recognize it as such. They thought they were reading a diary that he had edited. I don't think that quite answers your question, but perhaps it like approaches it a little bit.
Will Roberts and then Kevin.
Thank you so much for coming and for the talk. I was struck by a disconnect between the Sontag quote, which is wonderful in the title, and the actual account of the plague. Because what strikes me is that the kingdom of the sick never rules itself, right? It's ruled by the kingdom of the healthy. Yeah. And the tale of quarantine at the end really drives that home, right? So is there, I don't know, it strikes me that maybe the right political analogy is not like that we travel between two polities, but that sometimes we're citizens in one polity and sometimes we're colonized by that colony, by that polity, right? Sometimes we're subject to the rules that are imposed by that polity. And so I'm just wondering if there's any, I don't know, if you can help me think through that relationship between colonization and the kingdom of the sick, and whether there's any possibility for something like self-rule of the sick.
That's such a great question. I was thinking about it a lot this morning because I was thinking about this article by Graham Hamill where he really picks up some of these themes and works with them. And he writes about quarantine as a type of political action and as a way of political thinking. And I think he considers it not in terms of colonization, but about the making of state sovereignty and state violence in the early modern period. He sort of toys with the idea that quarantine policies reflect a kind of absolute power that was coming to be formed and theorized during this period that doesn't connect well with Sontag's two kingdoms, but that is sort of how he thinks about it. And then he considers whether there might be more democratic alternatives that were alive during this period, local and what we might call maybe more horizontal, like practices of care that might look like self-rule, right? We don't get much of that in Defoe, although we get a little bit of it. So as I've been thinking about it, I've been thinking about these two different models of political organization and rule. One, a form of sort of absolute sovereignty that we see being theorized in political texts from this period, and then another, what we might call more democratic alternative. But I think the colonization metaphor is also really interesting because it is worth it thinking about how these two kingdoms might interplay with one another. She sort of suggests that we have passports to both of them and we move in different times in our lives and become part of these communities, but she doesn't really say anything about how they're governed. And I think the colonization model might be a way of thinking through this. You know, those who govern are at least at the moment healthy. They may not be forever, but they are the ones that sort of impose this order on the sick. And so that might be another way to think about it that I hadn't considered before. So thank you.
Thank you. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for the talk. And just going off Professor Roberts's quick question, I was wondering how we might consider responsibility and duty between these two different polities, especially given like the change in government capacity to now treat and postpone the eventuality of like vaccines and reliable care in comparison to the examples given in the text, that there might be some different senses of responsibility and duty that the healthy then need to provide for the sick, and if these could be deliberated and thought of in advance. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I like that question a lot. So one way I might respond to it is that we see glimmers of this even in the text itself. Like before, we had more sophisticated technologies and ways of understanding how diseases come to be, how they're transmitted, how they might be cured. Although I would say, you know, without painting too broadly, like some of the confusion that is documented in the text really reminded me of the very early days of our own pandemic and the transmission of inaccurate information, quackery, strange cures, and whether people should be held responsible for the kind of information and suggestions that they put out into the general public. But to return to your question, I do think we see some glimmers of the kind of responsibility and care that you're speaking about, even in these texts. And maybe this does connect nicely with the prior question, because it's really about, I think, not only the structures of surveillance and watching that are set up, the colonization metaphor, I think, counts for something there, but also these kinds of practices in care and memory and documentation, right, that were practiced by people who were, frankly, coerced into doing this kind of work, but that also instantiated real care and nurturing for people who were sick. I mean, these were healthy people entering homes and caring for people who were sick. We're documenting deaths and losses and publicizing them to the community in an effort to create greater safety. More deaths in this parish, more deaths in this neighborhood, stay away. So we see, I think, some practices of individual care and responsibility, as well as communal care and responsibility in the work that a lot of these poor women were doing in these communities. Now, it wasn't always by free choice, but I don't know that necessarily undermines like the meaning and dedication of the work that they did. So thanks for that question. I really appreciate it.
The queue is Catherine Liu, Felix Vincent, Eve Winter, and Daniel Weinstock.
Thank you very much. That was really, really fascinating. So actually, a few weeks ago, we had another talk by a medieval historian, Faith Wallace, and who talked about the time of collapse, especially, of the plague year. And one of the points that she brought up that I wonder if you're thinking about as well is how Defoe's work is written about 60 or 70 years after the actual bubonic plague happens. So there is kind of the point about the reconstruction of the plague, in his memory. And she contrasts his account with Samuel Pepys' account, which apparently is incredibly much less sort of frantic in the sense, like his life goes very well. He travels around, and he might have met he might have seen one dead body, and he knew one person who died, but he, so his whole experience is so different from Defoe's narrative that, does this help your case that in a way Defoe is trying to, create a certain memory of the plague that invokes more solidarity than there actually really was in the actual experience of the plague itself, and how much the state is involved in mediating that experience. Even in Pepys' time, the main anxiety he gets is from reading the bills of mortality, right? Not because he himself actually experiences any problems. Thank you.
That's so interesting. So Defoe himself, I think, wouldn't have remembered much of the plague. He was very young, I think a toddler. So he probably had no memory of his own from leaving the city. So what he wrote was almost entirely reconstructed, as you say, right, from historical records. And I think that would give him a different experience. I would go back maybe to thinking about the text and how it's positioned in time, right? That it is a reconstruction sort of twice over of the past, right? It's drawn entirely from the historical record that he studied, possibly from memoirs from his family members who survived or lived through the plague. And he presents it as something that is carried out almost entirely in hindsight. But really, the eye is always towards 1722, right? So he's really always forward-thinking in the text, even as it is a representation of the past. And this sort of allows him to do whatever he wants, in a way, right? To sort of tell the story he wants to tell about what happened in the 1660s. And much of what he presents is what they knew. But he can stylize it, right, however he wants. And so he builds this city of circulation and threat and illness, and it's a very sort of rich bird's eye view from this narrator that he has running all over the city during this time. So I think one way I might answer your question is that in many respects, in spite of its constant reference to the past, the real purpose of the text is future oriented, always, right? And maybe that allows him to do more. it is interesting. It's a very different portrayal than what we get from Pepys, what we know about Newton and his like highly productive period of solitude and scholarly production during the plague that is almost nothing like, the middle class rendering of HF as a sort of man on the street. So I like that question a lot. I'll have to think about it some more.
Hi. Is this on? Okay. Thank you for your enlightening talk on a dark topic. So my question is on the contested term of justice. Mm-hmm. So like the idea of justice is generally that it prevails among relative equality of people, and that it entails to some degree a duty not to harm others. So it seems that pandemic time tests what justice is supposed to be like and how it's supposed to be instantiated, because it disrupts the hierarchies of expertise, as you mentioned, and also completely changes the equality between people, because someone might have a higher status or they might be physically stronger and domineering in normal time, but when the plague hits, they become the disabled person who has to be locked up at home. So how does justice relate to how we evaluate plague response, or is there other relevant normative criteria for evaluating the response to pandemic? Did that make sense?
It does make sense.
Thank you.
So, yeah, I think you're right. It does. There is a story there about the disruption of hierarchies of expertise, and maybe also like hierarchies of social and political authority and hierarchies of spiritual authority, right? You see all of these being sort of turned inside out. If not by the plague itself, then certainly within the confines of Defoe's analysis of it. One thing he does pay close attention to, which I didn't talk to so much today, is that other forms of social stratification sort of hang tough, right? Royalty, upper class people, they're gone, like as soon as it starts. Like they have places to go, they leave, and they don't come back until it's over. And so really the only people that are left behind to contend with this experience of plague are what we would today call the middle class, what he would have called the middling sort, and poor people, and caregivers, and some local public officials. So the arrangement of society is changed like pretty dramatically as soon as the plague starts. Which is perhaps what leads some people to talk about it as sort of a great leveling event to some degree. As to the question of whether justice is the right criterion for thinking through responses to the plague, I think one could make the case that for Defoe it is one of the key criteria for thinking through responses. I take his text to be arguing that there will always be suffering, regardless of what kinds of decisions are taken, and that people will always suffer from some form of injustice during these kinds of crises. But I also take him to be investing quite a lot of time in confronting these and sort of understanding them as the tragic consequence of decision making during times of great crisis. And this could apply to others as well. So I think while he doesn't quite articulate it in those terms, that is one of the sort of undercurrents of the kinds of questions that he's asking us to think through in the text, if that's helpful. Thank you for that question.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the breakdown of the epistemic and scientific authority of medicine.
Should be green.
Okay. Green now, sorry. Okay, I was wondering if you could say a little more about the breakdown of epistemic and scientific authority and the breakdown of medicine as a scientific field in that moment, the emergence of quackery, forms of profiteering, and conspiratorial type of practices. And I'm wondering specifically whether this might connect to a different vision of society. And again, maybe to go back to the Sontag quote that Will brought up, rather than thinking about two different kingdoms, thinking about one kingdom that is riven through by profiteering, by conspiratorial practices, by a kind of a conspiracy against the sick. And so I wonder whether, instead of calling it onerous citizenship, it's kind of like a breakdown of citizenship insofar as all these. I mean, it's not a great leveling at all. In fact, it's the establishment of very strict forms of domination, and not so much the domination of the sick by the healthy, but the domination of the sick by probably a very slim class of the healthy, and they may not even be healthy, right? I mean,
that's the other thing. Yeah, I was thinking about that actually as you were talking. I was like, they may very well be sick or soon dead themselves, right? And that's what he says precisely near the end of his analysis of quackery and conspiratorial thinking and this kind of exploitation. As he says, these people were never got rid of except by the plague itself, like wiped most of them out in the end. And this sort of brutal moment in the text, like he suggests, like that's really what it took, right? Is that they had to die. So this is a very interesting question, I think, to think through. It almost makes me, if I can be a bit playful, want to sort of rework the Sontag to think a little bit about maybe two kingdoms with quite different approaches to risk, right? And that certainly in the sort of the kingdom of the sick, people are suffering. That's the passport they're using. But there are others there with them that are healthy, that are trying to ameliorate their sufferings and losses. And so this is a very particular approach to thinking about the future as a place of sort of profound insecurity and loss. And I think we can place like their caregivers, maybe some like local magistrates, some members of the medical community there, even as all of these sort of construct a pretty fragile epistemological community. And then maybe there's another kingdom of different kinds of risk takers, right, who see this looming future as a place to be exploited, right, for profiteering and gain and the exercise of what we might call a peculiar kind of freedom, like under these kinds of circumstances at the expense of those who are vulnerable and dying. So maybe that's a different configuration than the one she gives us. But I mean, I think it's one that he maps out pretty cleanly in the text. I'll have to think more about where the clergy fit in here. He's quite a skeptic. He classifies them as well-meaning and not attempting to profit. But he also construes them as people who made things much worse than they had to be. So they sort of maybe occupy some other kind of strange position in neither of these places. Thank you. That gives me a lot to think about.
Hi, thanks very much for the talk. So I'm going to continue sort of exploring the metaphor of citizenships, and I'm wondering. So I have to confess, I haven't read Defoe's book, though I have read a lot of other sort of plague fiction during the plague, ours.
Everybody was doing it, yeah.
And didn't get to Defoe, though maybe I should. And the question is, a lot of the plague literature that I've read, and some of what you've said suggests that. Either there's a citizenship that overlays the sort of the two citizenships that we talk about, or that is in fact a citizenship that we should be thinking more in terms of because it's the actual one that we occupy, which is kind of like, and it links with the theme of your book, a citizenship of risk, right? Yeah. It's not like they're ontologically these two classes of people. It's that we are all, as it were, walking around with a Damocles sword. Yeah. I don't know if you've read Orhan Pamuk's plague novel. For those of you who are going to read it and who don't want to have like the first 50 pages spoiled, maybe put your fingers in your ears. But he does this wonderful sort of writerly thing where he introduces a character at the beginning who you have every expectation is going to be sort of a central character of the novel, and then he kills him in the first 50 pages because he catches the plague, right? Sorry. And
well, you can never get too attached to any of the people in these books, I think, is like a general
but
thing.
It's a wonderful way, in a way. When I read it, I wasn't thinking in terms of these two citizenships of saying we're all kind of in the same boat, whether today I feel fine. And so I was wondering whether, there's anything in Defoe that suggests thinking in terms of a common citizenship rather than of these two sort of separated ones.
That's quite interesting. So, I mean, what I quite like about the Sontag is she positions it as dual citizenship, that everyone holds two passports, right? So you never move definitively. You live in one kingdom maybe for all of your life, but there's always the chance that you might travel to another, and she suspects that most of us will. Some of us will go back to the kingdom of the healthy, others won't. So I think she always sort of thinks about these two kingdoms together, and as people who either have belonged to one or the other or both through the course of their lives, or who will, right? As to whether Defoe gives us anything that helps us think about it, I mean, I think so. Like he himself is in a way such a person, right? As having he's dug through this past archive. He himself survived as a very small boy, and now he's preparing for the next. So he sort of is the figure who has both passports ready at all times, which makes him quite an interesting figure, I think. The other thing I would say is that in the conclusion of the book, he sort of suggests that, you can move sort of fluidly back and forth, right? He ends the text like with a focus on those who have survived, right? As a sort of reminder to the reader that they might survive the next visitation, although their residence in this kingdom of the sick will be a bitter and difficult one, and not all of them will survive. It's interesting to think about it as the two kingdoms of risk, though, which I think is something that I would also wager that Defoe gives us a way of thinking about how people move back and forth between these two kingdoms as well. Yeah, I'll have to think more about whether this is a common feature of plague literature, but I really like that question.
Great.
Thank you.
We have a few pieces of closing business before we thank Professor Nacol and adjourn to the reception next door. The first is the order of events afterwards. The reception will happen in the adjoining ballroom. People who are on the list for dinner, please assemble outside the doors on the second floor on the landing at 6:50 so that we can get downstairs and get to taxis to make it to the restaurant. The second I will ask for Professor Nacol's help on. I will ask you to hold the book and the list of numbers while we do the giveaway
I didn't know this is
to
how
a
it was gonna go. I'm
student.
excited.
That is number 33.
Najla Mohammed. Did I pronounce her name correctly?
Najla?
Are you here? I see
Okay.
your hand.
Okay.
Woo! All right.
Come on up and get your book, and I'll keep doing the rest of the announcements. Upcoming events. There are 2 more lectures in the RGCS Lecture Series this semester. On February 22nd, Professor Nacol's colleague, Joseph Cairns, will be giving a lecture on reality and political theory. And on March 14th, Kevin Elliott from Yale University will be giving a lecture on democracy for busy people. One thing that I sometimes do at these events, partly for the sake of the audience and partly for the sake of the future audience on YouTube, is to provide some footnotes so that there's a sense of year-to-year continuity in RGCS events. And I want to note 2 things. One is that there are very important links and continuities between Professor Nacol's lecture and the RGCS lecture given by Melissa Schwartzberg from New York University in May of 2021 that was called Constitutionalism and Local Knowledge from the Black Death to COVID. And the second you're not quite going to find on YouTube, but there's still a reference at the end of it. The first thing that happened on Zoom, the first thing that happened remotely for RGCS after COVID struck, was a series of reading groups that happened among students and alumni and faculty in the summer of 2020. One of which was about a novel that was written by someone who had, until recently at that point, been the administrative coordinator of the Lynn Center. She had written a novel about a global outbreak of a novel coronavirus issuing from China that she had sent to the publisher in late 2019. A thoroughly researched novel and a really wonderfully beautiful novel that the publisher rushed into ebook form very rapidly come the late spring and early summer. And so we had one of the very first reading groups about it just using the ebook because the physical book still wasn't ready for months yet to come. And that author is Salima Nawaz Webster, and the book is the wonderful Songs for the End of the World. And I think that was all the bits of business. So with that, I will ask you to join me afterwards at the reception and join me in thanking very warmly Professor Emily Nacol.